Hi, this is Jamey with Stonemaier Games. I'm here with Biddy today, and we're going to talk about victory points in board games. There was recently a video from the Shut Up and Sit Down convention Shucks, where there was a panel, well, not a panel, there was a talk given by Scott Westerfield, an author, a young adult author, and he kind of blasted victory points. I think the title of the talk was Victory Points Suck. I'll link to it below if you want to check it out. And I think Scott made some really interesting points about narrative in games and how games build to a climactic moment and a memorable climax at the end of the game. But I actually love a lot of games that use victory points. And so I wanted to give them a little love today and talk about 10 games I love that use victory points and why I think victory points are the right thing for these games. I'll go over pretty much 10 different ways that I think victory points really come out in these games and do great things. So I'll talk about a few things surrounding the talk at the end of the video, but for now I want to jump to the 10 games. So the first one on my pile, these are in no particular order really, there's just 10 games I love, is On Tour. On Tour is a game where it's a roll and write game where you are charting a tour across the US, and you're trying to basically create the longest tour using numbers that you must write in on the states on here. And so at the end of the game, you're going to have a full map of numbers, and you're going to try to draw a line through these numbers in ascending order. This game could have just been a game about routes, building that route. And it is a route building game. But it does something really cool, I think, that adds nice tension to the game and that makes points a necessity in the game. Because what the designer could have done is just said, okay, at the end of the game, connect as many routes as possible, or as many states as possible in ascending order, and that is your score. So if you have 20 states connected, your score is 20, which would have been fine. And the game that's half the game right there. But the game adds a little twist in that you have these cards that come up that determine the regions where you need to write down a number. So if this card comes up, you'll need to write down one of the current numbers on the dice in this northern region. And it adds this little twist where it says, if you happen to write down that number in Kentucky, so Kentucky is an area in that region, but specifically in Kentucky, then you get to circle Kentucky on the map. You get to circle it. And at the end of the game, that's worth an extra point. And so this adds... It steers players early in the game when they have an empty map and they have so many choices. It gives them a little bit of a direction to go, and it also gives you a really tough choice in the middle and late game. Do you fill in that circle? Do you use that circle if it's even available, or do you write down the number elsewhere? Because it may be a much more difficult puzzle to write down the number in Kentucky at certain points in the game versus anywhere else in that northern region. So I think just adding that little twist, the game could have been simpler, but by adding that little twist and adding the necessity of points, I think it makes On Tour a better game, and a game that I really, really enjoy. So that's On Tour. The next game on my list, I have my list down here, is, let's do Fantasy Realms, because Fantasy Realms is a game that's almost completely driven by points. There are some other elements to consider, but really you will have a hand of cards, and you are trying to build that hand of cards up to the end of the game. So you do start with a hand of cards, a hand of 7 cards. I drew 7 here. And at the end of the game, you're also going to have 7 cards, and those are going to be the cards that you score. And points are the game in Fantasy Realms. It's not a game about killing a dragon or some other fantasy theme. The game is about accumulating these points and creating combos between these cards. So each card has points in the upper left-hand corner, but it also has things like penalties where it says like, oh, this card is worth nothing unless you have a flame in hand. So you're trying to get a flame in hand then, or you're trying to get rid of this card. The Collector, I played this one the other day. The Collector gives you a ton of points if you have, let's see if you can see it there, if you have 5 different cards in the same suit. So even though the Collector itself isn't worth all that much, these points are driving the decisions that you're making in the game, both in terms of gaining points and being penalized for things that you're doing if you don't avoid certain cards in hand. So I think in a game like this, in a combo building game, I think points can really, really shine because they make you feel awesome when you pull together that combo. Like in that game the other day that I was alluding to, I had the collector and I pulled off that combo. I managed to work around some restraints from penalties in my hand, and I got 5 different cards of the same suit, and I was rewarded by 100 points, which is a ton of points. So I think points in this game, they work as a very strong reward, and they really drive the combo decisions in the game. That's Fantasy Realms. Again, these are in no particular order, basically the order that I have them in a stock over here, and I have some games that I don't actually own. I'll do one of those right now. I don't own the Quacks of Quedlinberg. So this is a push your luck game where you are, and a bag building game where you're putting together these different potions and you're drawing them out of a bag and hoping that you don't bust. And there's a certain way, you can look into the rules of the game if you want, there's a certain way that you can bust in the game. But Quacks does something really interesting because it's almost inevitable in a game of Quacks that you probably will bust if you are trying to actually push your luck and advance in the game. You are probably going to bust at some point. And I think the thing that Quacks does really interesting with victory points is that when you do bust, you have a decision to make between either taking the points based on where you are, how far you've advanced on this potion track. You either get the points or you can get resources to spend on new tokens to make your bag better, to make your potion building abilities better. And so it uses points. Even though it's a point-driven game, the winner's decided by victory points. It uses points as a decision point. In those instances when you bust, do you take the points and move forward towards winning the game, or do you take the resources, the currency, to build your engine to make yourself better at moving towards winning the game later in the game? So it's this tough balance between points and engine building, really, that you see in other deck building games as well. But in Quacks, it really comes out. It's really highlighted. And so I like that points are used kind of as a balancing mechanism in the game, and a point of tension and a point of decision making. Do you take the points or do you build your engine better? I really, really like that in the Quacks of Quedlinburg. Another game that I have is Isle of Skye. This is one of my favorite games. And Isle of Skye also uses victory points, like all these games that I'm talking about today. But Isle of Skye, and I'm not going to take it out of the box because everything will fall everywhere. But in Isle of Skye, points are used as a catch-up mechanism. Because at the end of every round, or most of the rounds in the game, you look at your position on the victory point track. And for every player who is ahead of you on that track, you get some coins. It depends on what round it is, but I think early in the game you're getting 1 coin. Later in the game you might be getting 3 or 4 coins, depending on the player count, and depending on how many players are ahead of you. You're getting 3 or 4 coins for each of those players. And so using this point, by being able to track your current status in the game using victory points, and having a separate resource, coins, you're able to create not only interesting decisions in the game, because you are deciding, okay, am I going ahead and getting points now, or am I going to linger back a little bit, get some points, but not push to the lead. But it also gives you a feeling that you always have a chance, and that you're always getting something in the game, even if you're falling behind in terms of points. So I really like that use of points as a metric of catch-up mechanism in Isle of Skye. Let's do another one that I don't own. Ganz Schon Clever. This is one of my new favorites. This is another roll and write game. And I don't know if this is the greatest example here, but in Ganz Schon Clever, it's a dice drafting game. And so there are decisions that you could make if you had perfect information about all the other players and how they were, and you do have perfect information. You can see what they're doing, but it's really tough to calculate the points in the middle of the game of Ganz Schon Clever. It would really slow down the game if you tried to do that. And so points basically in Ganz Schon Clever, they obfuscate the leader, which I think can be really, really important in certain games. Not all games that use victory points, but certain games that use victory points. If you could otherwise be making decisions that directly hurt players. And kind of impede their ability to have fun. Instead, by using victory points as a way of convoluting and obfuscating who is the leader in this game, it puts the impetus on you when you make a decision, a dice drafting decision. You're deciding what's best for you. You're not really looking at all at what the other players are doing or what they need, or very, very little. You're doing that very rarely in Ganz Schon Clever. So I like that use of victory points as a way of hiding the leader in certain games. That's Ganz Schon Clever. I'll do another game that I have here, Downforce. Downforce actually almost didn't make this list because I forgot that it used points, but Downforce does. It uses money as points, which I'll talk about more in a minute in reference to another game. But in Downforce, it is a racing game. You are trying to finish the race first, but the entire game doesn't come down to you finishing the race first, because it's also a betting game. You're betting on other cars to possibly finish, or betting on cars, not necessarily other cars. You could bet on your own car, but you are betting on cars to determine who will get the most money at the end of the game based on which cars you bet on. And you bet several times throughout the game. And I think this was a brilliant design decision in Downforce to not just make it about the first car to cross the line. There's a great story to be told there about which car crosses the line first. But by separating that from the victory points, the money earned at the end of the game to determine the winner, it gives players a lot more interesting decisions in the game, rather than just having it be a race from start to finish. Downforce is a game with a lot of interaction, and a lot of positive interaction, but also some negative interaction, where you're playing a card and you're moving multiple cars forward on the track. And so in doing so, you're so invested in other players throughout the game. And it's also quite possible just to get stuck in the back of the pack in Downforce. And so rather than have a player who gets stuck behind feel like they're completely out of it, Downforce kind of divorces this idea of finishing the race first from the winner of the game by letting you bet on those other cars. So even if you fall behind, you can be betting on other cars and even helping other cars instead of your own car to try to win the race and win the game. I think that was a brilliant design decision made in Downforce. Let's do another one that I don't have, A Feast for Odin. I don't have A Feast for Odin. Probably the heaviest game on this list. It's a worker placement game with a ton of different action spots. And it does two really interesting things, I think, with victory points. One being that you start off with negative points in this game. Points are a major motivator in this game for moving forward. You start off with an empty village, an empty map, an empty player map, really, and you're trying to make up for those victory points. So in A Feast for Odin, it's using points as a motivator to do something in the game. You're motivated right from the beginning to fill up your board with stuff. The game is telling you through the points, you need to do this. This is really important for the game. It's not a game about who's the fastest to fill up that board. It's about building that board itself, incentivized by victory points. The other thing that A Feast for Odin does, and a lot of Uwe Rosenberg games do, is that it uses victory points as a soft incentive to do something. So beyond this example that I've already given you, you need to have a feast every round in A Feast for Odin. You need to feed the elders of the village, I think is who you're feeding. And so you're trying to get some food during each round to feed these elders. And the penalty for not doing so is that you lose some victory points if you don't feast. And actually, it's very rare in A Feast for Odin that you don't do this, that you don't actually feed your elders. But when you do, you lose some points. And I think I've seen this in some other Uwe Rosenberg games too. I think this is really important that you just lose some points. And while that is discouraging, you don't want to ever lose points in a game like this. In a non-points game, that it might give you a permanent penalty, like it might make you sacrifice a worker permanently, or might make you have this ongoing penalty that hurts you. That really wouldn't feel as good as just losing a few points. So I like that it's an incentive that feels like something you should pursue, but it doesn't completely ruin your game plan. If the game had been if they designed this game around not having any victory points at all. That's A Feast for Odin. Tzolk'in is one of my other favorite games, and this I think does something really crucial, or not crucial, but it does something with victory points that I think is a great idea with games that use victory points, which is you gain points during the game, so you have this feeling of advancement during the game, but there are also several key ways to earn points at the end of the game, through the monuments, some conversion of resources, and so I like this idea that you feel progress during the game through the victory points, but there's also a bunch of points that you get at the end, hopefully, that can often decide the winner. So I like that there's that sense of progress during the game, but that the winner isn't really decided until the end. And also with the points conversion at the end of the game, or the resource conversion, you're converting all these things to victory points. It gives you this feeling that all the stuff that you accumulated during the game still has meaning at the end of the game. It's not just gone because you didn't accomplish whatever arbitrary goal the game set out to give you. One of the key points made in Scott's talk was that games don't tell as good of a story if they use victory points. And this is something that I'm sure there are games that I think Scott could be right about here. But I think an example of a game that I think does the exact opposite of this is Castles of Mad King Ludwig. I think Castles of Mad King Ludwig, because it uses points, victory points in the game, it lets players and enables players to tell their own story in the game. It uses points as a way of incentivizing certain crazy structures in the game. So it might say, okay, in this game, you'll get a bunch of points if you have really big gardens, and if you have the most kitchen type rooms. And so the game is telling you, okay, here's some directions you can go, and the game is trying to push you towards having a pretty zany castle, because that's a big part of this game, about having kind of Mad King castles. And so I think that's great. I think the game is pushing you towards that. It's using points as an incentive to do that. But also because the game isn't the game isn't defining for yourself what a crazy castle is or a mad castle is. It leaves open room for you to define that for yourself. I'm not explaining this very well. It made more sense when I wrote it down. But basically, I think victory points enable players to tell their own story and to take their own path, because there are so many different options with victory points, as is the case with Mad King Ludwig. There's so many different types of ways that you can get points from rooms, from completing rooms to scoring those end of game tiles, to getting bonus points. There are all these different ways that you can go, and the end result is that each player is going to have a very, very different castle, and that is the story of the game. That you end up with these very different castles that score very different, that look very different, that have rooms that should never be connected in real life. And the victory points enabled that story rather than constricting it. Because the opposite version of this game, I think the Scott Westerfield version, would be that the game tells you what a crazy castle looks like, and you have to accomplish that as close as you can. And I think that would just be so much less interesting than being able to tell your own story through your own crazy castle. That's Castles of Mad King Ludwig. I think the last game I have, this is the last one, is Clank. And Clank, similar to Downforce, uses coins as victory points. They are essentially victory points. You are adding them up at the end of the game and comparing them to other players. But I think this is a great example of a game that uses a thematic version of victory points to drive the story and drive the decisions you make in the game. You're trying to end up with the most money. And so I think that's a nice little twist you can use in a game with victory points. I do it in Scythe as well, where even though it effectively is victory points, it feels more thematic because it's money in this game, or maybe it's reputation in another game. However you want to represent victory points in your game, I think by taking away a little bit of the abstract nature of them, that can really bring out the theme. And I think Clank does that so well. Clank is this, it's a deck building game where you're running down into a dungeon, grabbing treasures, grabbing coins, and then getting out. And if you get out, you're rewarded by the villagers with even more coins. So it's driven by money, and it makes sense because it's a game where you're trying to get rich by running into a dungeon. So those are my 10 games, 10 examples of ways that I think victory points can lead to interesting decisions in games, I think they can work better than non-victory point games. Although I will say that I am going to do a video about my top 10 games, or top 10 games I love that don't use victory points, because I want to look at the other perspective as well. There's a response from Gil Hova, another designer of the Networks. He runs Formal Fair Art Games. He did a great write-up, a great response to Scott Westerfield, because in Scott's talk, he kind of says that victory points are never good. That's I don't even know if I would say kind of. Like, he directly says it. He says victory points suck. They're not good. You should find a better way to tell a story in your game. But like I mentioned with Castles of Mad King Ludwig, while I think games can tell great narratives by sometimes not having victory points, I think they can actually that's the game telling you the story that it wants to tell, which makes perfect sense. Coming from an author, Scott Westerfield, he's telling you the story that he wants to tell. He's not writing choose your own adventure books. But in a board game, I want to tell my story. I want to build my unique castle. I want to build my weird tour across the U.S. for my rock band. I want to build my own version of a Mayan empire. I want to bet on a race in Downforce and come out the winner, even though my car was last in the race. That's the story that I want to tell in these games. Or stories that I could tell that might be different from the stories that you want to tell, or even different than the story the game wants to tell. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's a great thing in many of these games that use victory points. Gil's blog goes into detail about some examples of how he thinks victory points can be better in these games, and how really about what Scott is saying is Scott is asking for different games. Like, he's not asking for. I think he's kind of missing out on what the designer's intentions were and where the fun is in these games. He's redesigning a completely different game. Which is fine if Scott wants to design a game. But Gil also talks about something that I think is important, which is talking in absolutes, which is saying that this is always bad, or this is always good, or saying that this thing is objectively bad, rather than even just saying, this is my opinion. And maybe Scott says that in the talk, but that's the way I like to talk about things. I like to talk about games that I love. I'm not saying that these are the best games with victory points. I'm saying that I love them. And the games that you love with victory points or without victory points might be different than mine. So I love the idea of not talking in absolutes in general. That's way off topic here in terms of victory points, but I think it's a really important point that Gil brought up. The last thing I wanted to mention is that there are no cooperative games on my list that use victory points. And I thought that was interesting. Like, there is a game that I love called Shipwreck Arcana, where you are racing to get 7 points, but I didn't put it on this list because it doesn't really feel like victory points. You're not accumulating points and reaching like a threshold that's higher than the points that the game presents to you. And I thought that was kind of interesting because in a lot of the cooperative games, these tell great stories, these cooperative games. Like, I'm looking at my shelf back here. I'm seeing Seventh Continent back there. I'm seeing Summit. I'm seeing Legendary Encounters, Alien. These are wonderful games. I love these cooperative games. But I'm wondering a little bit, like, could any of them have been better with victory points? Because so many cooperative games, I think it's almost second nature to not use victory points in cooperative games. Hanabi, I guess, does have it. Hanabi's back there and does have victory points. But it's just interesting to me that they don't necessarily do that. There's a win or lose condition in cooperative games, and you either achieve that win condition to win, or you trigger the lose condition and lose, which adds a lot of great tension to the games. I'm not at all saying that that's a bad thing, but I'm wondering at all if players could have more of a sense of freedom in certain cooperative games, and if that could be a good thing in certain cooperative games, if points were used instead of a win or loss condition. And maybe there would still be a loss condition to create tension in the game, to move players towards an inevitable conclusion and make sure the game doesn't last forever. But I think players could have a lot of freedom if victory points were used in cooperative games. So I wanted to see if you have any examples of games where cooperative games where points are used and where it really, really works. Hanabi does come to mind, but Hanabi is such a streamlined game. I think I'm looking for something a little bit bigger and more thematic as an example here. So yeah, those are some of my favorite games that use victory points. I'd love to hear some examples of games that you like that use victory points and why you think victory points are integral to your love of those games. That's today's topic for today's Sunday Sit Down. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and I will see you there. All right, thanks.